Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the UC ANR Fire Network's After the Fire Chicken and Livestock Safety webinar. My name is Katie Lowe, and I'm the Fire Network Coordinator, and tonight I'm going to help facilitate the webinar. So this webinar is for interested residents, resource professionals, and community members who want to learn more about backyard chicken and livestock safety post-fire. But before we begin tonight, I want to just let folks know that during the presentation, you may see many pictures of burned homes, landscapes, or communities. These images may evoke a strong emotional response, particularly for those of you who may have been impacted by fire. So if you start to feel overwhelmed, please feel free to step away from the webinar and return when you feel comfortable. Just want to take a second to introduce our speakers for tonight. We're joined by Tracy Schohr from UC Cooperative Extension and also Richard Blatchford from UC Davis. And we're also joined by Fire Network staff member Joaquin Pastrana, who will help moderate questions tonight.
All right. Thanks, Katie. So just for a small introduction, I'm an extension specialist at UC Davis, and I work with poultry, both small and large scale. So I do a lot of backyard flock outreach. One thing that's a little bit different about poultry than other animal species is that we don't actually have any current county level advisors for poultry. So there's myself, and then I have a colleague in the vet school who also works with poultry. So if you are interested in poultry questions, you are more than welcome to reach out to either of us um, here at Davis, and we will do whatever we can to help you get the information that you need. So tonight I was asked to talk about some of the contamination risks and safety issues with backyard chickens and post-fire environments, and ways that we can mitigate some of those risks. Mhm. Not advanced. There we go. Okay. So I just wanted to give a really quick background on why do people have backyard chickens? We know this is something that's been growing for the last 20 plus years. COVID times actually increased the amount of people who had backyard chickens. And back in the early 2010s, we put out a survey. And we asked people lots of questions, but one of the things that we asked was, why did they have backyard chickens? And so here's some of the results of that survey. So one of the questions we asked was, do you identify with the local food movement? Are you a breeder? So this would encompass people who not only breed chickens, but 4-H, FFA kinds of projects. And then we asked, do you have chickens just for pets? So you can see the overwhelming amount of responses were that people identified somehow with the local food movement. And really that's about people wanted to have a little bit of control over their food. And chickens are a really nice way to do that because they don't take very much more care than your typical dog or cat, and you don't need a lot of space to have them. And you can also get a food product without having to sacrifice the animal. Um, but interestingly, you can also see that quite a few people had them as pets. So a lot of people get chickens for the eggs, and then they end up becoming pets. One of the other things that we looked at was, where are backyard chickens? Where are the people who are keeping them? We sort of have in our mind that probably more rural areas, but what we actually found was that there were equal numbers of birds in rural areas and birds in urban areas. So both of these kinds of environments are very typical. We also know that people in really urban, so places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, there are a lot of backyard chickens in those areas as well, including people who even will keep them on their balcony in high rises. And where this is will come more into play as we go through the presentation. So when we talk about contamination, post-fire contamination, and how does that relate to chickens, um, we're really thinking about, well, I'm going to focus on eggs. There can be some issue with meat. but most people don't keep chickens for meat, so we're just going to talk about eggs. If you have questions about meat, we can certainly talk about that in the question answer session. So we know that the biggest concern with contamination are heavy metals. So for example, particularly lead, which is a known issue already. Hens consume heavy metals in the environment. So I'll talk a little bit more about this, but we know most of what we know is about lead. So we know that hens consume lead. They deposit lead in their eggs. Um, and even though hens can have clinical levels of lead toxicity, so they're experiencing lead poisoning themselves, and we know that they do show symptoms, what we found is that most hens actually don't show signs or easy to spot signs of lead toxicity, even if they have clinical levels. And this was discovered by the pathology lab, which I'll talk about coming up, where secondarily they were finding hens with really high levels of lead, but had died for other reasons. So they wouldn't have ever known that they had these lead levels unless they had been doing a necropsy for something else. One of the big issues with heavy metals, and something that we found in our survey, is that a lot of people are also getting chickens because they want to teach their family about where food comes from. And so a lot of people who responded to our survey had young children. And we know that especially lead is very problematic in developmental issues for kids. And so this is sort of a big issue, a big little issue. You think it would be a bigger issue. But because lots of children are eating these eggs that have some level of lead, um, there could be some potential problems here. So knowing what your lead situation is or other heavy metal situation is really important. So where does lead come from? Well, generally, even without fire, um, lead is in our environment. So we know that it's there. You can test for it. Hopefully, you don't find too much of it. As you can imagine, most often it's found in urban areas, but that's not exclusive. The industrial history of urban areas leads to more exposure, environmental exposure of heavy metals and lead, which just leads to a bigger reservoir in the environment. Um, but we know that we had lead paint for quite a while. People still have lead paint in their houses. Chickens find this irresistible, so they see these specks of color, chipped up paint. You can imagine that an animal who is foraging for probably bugs might see that and say, hey, this is rotting wood. There might be bugs under here, and they scratch up and then they inadvertently eat it. They will also directly eat paint chips off of buildings. So if it's chipping, they will pick at it. So here you can see this top picture is a step porch, so very easy for the birds to access. But also you have to think about places that the birds may not be able to directly access, so such as these eaves that are chipping paint, where the paint may fall to the ground, and then the birds can get access to that. As far as egg contamination, there are a couple places that we worry about. Primarily, we worry about the yolk. So yolks are made out of fat, essentially. And we know that several heavy metals are very fat loving, so we call it lipophilic. And so they get deposited when the hen is making the egg, they get deposited into that yolk. And so heavy metals like lead, mercury, and chromium can all be found in high concentrations in yolk. In the albumin or the egg white, you tend to see less levels than you would in the yolk, but they're different types of metals. So things like arsenic and cadmium can um, become prevalent in egg whites. And then the eggshell can actually have very high levels of lead incorporated into it. We don't necessarily worry about that as much though, because we're generally not eating the eggshell. However, there are people who feed back eggshell to their chickens as a calcium supplement. And so then in that situation, you might want to think about, am I just putting lead back into the system? And as I mentioned before, most of the information we know about heavy metals going into eggs has to do with lead. And that's just because lead, probably about 15 years ago, in urban areas, we were starting to find levels of lead in eggs. And so there's been some investigation into lead in eggs, but there's a lot that we still don't know. So, what don't we know? Um, One, we don't really know how much lead do hens need to ingest to actually deposit lead into the egg. Do they have to ingest a lot or just a little? How much of what they ingest actually goes into the egg? How long does the hen store lead? So lead is in her body. How long does it persist there? How long can she continue to deposit lead into eggs? And then we really don't know very much about other contaminants. So we don't really know much about lead, and that's the one we know the most about, but we really don't know very much about other contaminants. And that's really just because there hasn't been very much research done. So how would fire affect contamination of eggs? It's not really super clear because, again, this is an area that hasn't been studied very much. There are a couple studies. So one I want to talk to you a little bit about is a study that came out of the School of Veterinary Medicine here at Davis. They went out and they tested eggs from various locations post-fire. And basically what they found is that there was no clear pattern of heavy metal contamination in eggs. And they concluded that it may depend on pre-fire contamination. So they tested eggs in rural areas and in urban areas, and they found even post-fire in some locations, those eggs had less contamination than non-fire exposed eggs in urban areas. So again, that environment of where they are and the contamination that may already exist seems to be more of a driver in contamination. So that's maybe some good news, but we should still be very cautious because this is one of very few studies that's been done, so our information is very preliminary at this point. What we would say is that it's a really good idea if you want to think about safely consuming eggs, know what your contamination risk is before a fire, and that will help you to determine some of the risk post-fire. So knowing if you're in a contaminated area to begin with is really good. You might want to even test eggs before you're in a fire situation to know, do I have any sort of contamination exposure risk? So how do you know? Um, there are a couple things you can do. You can test soil, and there are a couple places you can go. And I've included the link down here to um, the backyard safety, backyard chicken safety. Um, Sorry, I just totally lost the word out of my head. Um, Fact sheet that you can access online, and that has links and information to these different programs. So the California Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program will test soil for you. And the UC ANR's Healthy Soils for a Healthy California website has a lot of resources for this as well. So basically, you take samples in different places and you send it off to a lab and they will test it for lead. And then for eggs, the California Animal Health and Food Safety Lab System, or CAFS for short, you can submit eggs, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But they will test for different types of heavy metals, including lead. So I want to talk a little bit more about CAFS. So if you don't know, CAFS is a statewide diagnostic lab system. So there are 4 labs throughout the state of California, and you can submit samples to any of these labs. So pick the one that's closest to you. And if they have to shift it to a different lab for certain testing, they will do that. The main job of these diagnostic labs is really to provide necropsy and pathology services. So really, farmers and backyard flock owners can submit birds that have died or are really, really sick, um, and they will try to determine the cause of the illness or the death. They can test specimens, so both animals, so tissue-based types of specimens, and animal products, so things like eggs. They will accept both. The nice thing about these labs is that the public can submit samples. And they do have a program for backyard flocks, specifically, where you get a really reduced rate. And I think I have that on the next slide. Yes. So I looked up the other just a couple days ago what the fees were off their website, so I could give you an idea. Um, with the disclaimer that sometimes these change unexpectedly. So definitely visit their website to see what the most up-to-date fee is. But if you have birds that you want to submit for a necropsy, it's currently $35 and you can submit up to 2 birds. So you can either submit them dead or live and they will humanely euthanize them. You can submit in person or you can ship. Yes, you can actually ship dead birds. Um, if you go to their website, they have information on shipping and you can call them and they will help you through that process. I will just say though, if you are going to ship a bird, make sure that you refrigerate the bird and not freeze it. Freezing damages all kinds of cells and things and makes it really hard for them to find out what may or may not be causing issues in your flock. Um, they test for various assorted heavy metals, and so you can go on and look to see lead is one of them. And the range of costs were somewhere between $55 and $74 per sample. And the sample, if you're submitting eggs, is a pool of 2 to 4 eggs. So you can pick 2 to 4 eggs and mix them up, and send that as one single sample, and they will test that. If you were submitting, for example, a bird and you wanted to have heavy metals tested from their tissue to see if the bird actually had contamination levels, you can see that's about $40 to $172 per sample. So not necessarily inexpensive to do these types of testing, but important. So what can you do? If you're in a situation where you have been through a fire and you have backyard chickens, and you want to keep them, what can you do to try to mitigate some of that contamination risk? The first thing I would say is definitely retest your eggs. So hopefully you have tested them already to know sort of what your baseline levels are. Um, Submit a new sample, have it retested, maybe a week or two after they've been exposed to potential contamination and see if anything has increased. You could also test soil. Um, and then I would just say if you're very worried and you don't know what your results are going to be, take a lot of caution in consuming those eggs. So you may not want to consume them until you have the results back. One thing you should do is keep chickens away from burned areas. So remember, they're going to be picking up most of this contamination by ingesting it off the ground. So you want to make sure that they're not in these burned areas that may have been exposed to heavy metal contamination. One of the ways you can do that um, is to keep them in a confined area. And you can put topsoil or shavings or sand or some sort of ground cover, straw, hay, that helps remove them from the potential contaminated soil. Don't feed them on the ground. So again, you want them consuming food where they're not consuming contaminated material. So you can hang things like waters and feeders. Um, you can see here in this picture, they've actually built a little bit of a feed table so that the birds go up. You want to make sure you're cleaning up any spilled feed that might be on the ground after they're eating. Um, Keep material from exposed hens out of the compost. So if you have animals that die and maybe you compost them, um, their carcasses, or if you have eggs or something else that you want to put in, maybe manure from the coop, until you sort of know what the contamination levels might be, you might want to keep that out of compost because you don't want to accidentally contaminate compost that you then spread in other areas, especially for food, gardening. So minimize that. And then there's some evidence that if you provide oyster shell, so oyster shell is available at most feed stores, it's a calcium supplement, that may actually help absorb lead out of the bird's body. However, the disclaimer for that is most birds don't really consume extra calcium unless they need it. Um, so if their body isn't sort of asking them to fulfill that need, they may not eat the oyster shell. It can't hurt to provide it though. And then I just also wanted to make a short note on egg production. So chickens, after a fire, it's very common for chickens just not to be laying eggs. And there's a couple reasons why. So chickens will naturally reduce or stop egg production in the fall or winter, and that just has to do with the amount of light that they're getting. They need at least 14 to 16 hours of light for their reproductive system to work. So they tend to decrease or completely stop production in fall and winter. Um, and other causes of egg failure could be things like disease or malnutrition, which both could potentially happen post-fire. But one of the biggest reasons why birds will stop laying eggs is because of stress. And certainly going through the experience of the fire, probably a hasty evacuation, being cooped up, it's very stressful for the birds. And so they will recover over time, but you just have to sort of let them go at their own pace. There's no sort of set recovery time where birds will begin to lay again. Reproduction is usually the first thing that their body will shut off to conserve energy in times of stress, perhaps put it out to their immune system, maintaining their general body. So once their body sort of recovers from the stress, they will start back up again. But again, that can be very variable. And so with that, I think I will take questions.
Thank you so much, Richard. We do have a question in the chat, or I mean in the Q&A session from Christy. They ask, how does poultry with lead in residential/urban farming differ from industrial farming that is more regulated?
Yeah, that's a good question. Can you repeat the first part of that?
Yeah, I can also paste it in the chat too. How does poultry with lead in residential/urban farming differ from industrial farming that is more regulated?
Yeah, so I think the biggest difference would be not most people who are doing residential urban farming may not know the contamination levels that already exist in the environment, where I think industrial farming probably does a lot more regular testing because they're really interested in the soil quality. Um, and just from what we do, the little bit that we do know is just that urban areas tend to be higher in terms of general contamination levels in the environment, um, than more rural areas. So likely, I would guess that residential urban farms may have higher levels, just because of this industrial, history of an urban area. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question for Richard? You can, it's a small enough group. I think if you wanted to, you could come off mute and ask your question. Okay. Well, maybe people are still processing questions. So maybe Richard, if they have additional ones, they could ask at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, everyone's welcome to reach out to me at any point, if you come up with questions later.
Thank you. And so now we will transition to our next speaker, Tracy.
Is that working, Katie?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Tracy Schohr, and I am a livestock and natural resources advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about broader livestock challenges in contamination and risk and safety concerns post-fire. So just to give a little overview, I'm going to talk about what some of those impacts are that we have heard on the larger livestock side. So thinking cattle, sheep, and goats. What have those natural resource impacts have been? Some of the research that we have been doing in UC Cooperative Extension with our counterparts at UC Davis and the UC Davis Veterinary School. Talk about some infrastructure challenges post-fire to consider, and also where you can go to get support for your livestock operation and resources that might be available of interest to you. So the first thing to think about, like the previous speaker shared, what has some of the work done? And so one project that we did in UC Cooperative Extension, working with some partners on campus at UC Davis, was to look at what have been the impact on fire on livestock producers. And so we surveyed 116 ranchers across 49 counties, and we asked them about what their plan was for fire preparedness, on fire response, and also fire recovery. And I think what I wanted to share with you here tonight is just to think about what are these impacts. And so if you're thinking fire that you have had a lot of impacts, that is a normal feeling, right? These fires are coming in and causing financial operating income instability. They're having direct impact on livestock and crops. We're seeing impacts to soils, watershed, and health. And so over half of people found it to be either a devastating or a significant impact on their operation. And when we were asking them about what those wildfire impacts were, particularly surrounding natural resources, where 48% of them had brought this up, they talked about increased runoff, reduced water infiltration, sedimentation in waterways, water contamination, the topsoil and erosion, and soil contamination. So really linking back to the previous speaker, as well as what is coming out of these fires. And so maybe to add a little engagement this evening is, if you have a second, to add in the chat, what have you been concerned about post-fire for your livestock? And Richard and I can answer those questions as they come in, but it would be good to get some feedback. So if you have something that's been on your mind, we want to make sure we answer it this evening. So if you take a second, add that in the chat, we will make sure that we get it covered. So moving on, I think the first thing to think about is your livestock health and wildfires, right? And so that goes before, during, and after. And so making sure you have that veterinary client-patient relationship. And so that is established before a fire. So if during a fire or after a fire, you need to access antibiotics or telemedicine, that you have the means to do that. And so making sure to have that relationship pre-established is critically important. The other one to think about is during fires. Stress was talked about in the previous presentation about being a challenge in the chickens wanting to lay eggs. And so again, with all other livestock, is making sure how can we limit that stress and limit additional dust and particulate matter in the air. And so some good tips that we like to share with livestock producers is don't work livestock or ride your horses when we have that bad air quality. Thinking about making sure they have clean feed and access to that feed, and they have clean water that they're able to access as well. And how can we reduce that smoke inhalation? And this is a picture of air quality in 2020 during the North Complex, where if you are in any of these areas, especially in that dark purple up in the Feather River Canyon in the hazardous side of 300 and above, where we were actually getting closer to 800 in some of those areas, your eyes would just burn. And so think about, if your eyes are burning and you're having trouble breathing, that also goes to livestock. So just taking care of yourself and taking care of your animals is critically important. Flipping channels a little bit here is to think about post-fire in the landscapes that you graze in. And so I wish there was a one-size-fits-all answer to what to do as a livestock producer post-fire, and a rangeland manager and a ranch manager, but it's not. It's really depending on when that fire impacts, what your resources are pre and post. And so, for example, a fire that happens like the Park Fire in Butte County, that was a summer fire, you have a lot more time to think about recovery and resources, whereas the campfire impacted producers in November, and the next thing you know, it was raining. And so these are really big challenges, right? And so I think a positive story, just wanting to start out with tonight, is to think about how resilient our landscapes are to fire. And I think this case study that we did on the Walker Fire up in the Plumas National Forest, looking at meadow health and revegetation post fire and where grazing fits in. And so this first picture that I'm going to show you here, the insert picture down at the bottom where you can see that the willows in where the pictures in the hands were a part of a back burn to try to stop the fire. And it really took out almost essentially all of those willows that were there. And in year one, we went back, I think this was about September of year one, and you can see that growth coming back in year one. In year two, you can see it coming back a little bit higher, a little bit thicker, a little bit stronger. And by year three, you can see a pretty good recovery of those willows in just 3 years without any additional management. And so I think that just shows you how resilient some of our landscapes in California can be to fire, and many of them adapted with fire as part of it. However, we've taken fire out of it for a number of years, and also sometimes the fuel load might be a lot higher, which could create more catastrophic impacts. And so I wish, like I said, there was a one case fits all answer to post management, but hopefully we can share with you some resources tonight to think about as if you impact fire, how can you make good responses to manage your land and your livestock at the same time. And so building on the conversation earlier about water quality and how water fits in. And so during the campfire, it came up that there wasn't really a known of what happens after a town burns and what happens to the watershed. There was one study in LA that we were able to find that talked about heavy metals post-fire in a controlled burn on a house. And so that's where we went looking at water quality. And so you can see the campfire scar in that picture and the 4 watering sites that we tested. We also did some testing in Paradise itself with permission from the sheriff's office. And so we started testing while the fire was still active before the first rain, and we continued that through March. And so we have a pretty good sample of what water was. Unfortunately, we didn't have any pre-sampling. But what we found out is that in terms of heavy metal, there was some higher manganese that we got. However, that's really a taste issue that came out. And so something to think about if the livestock aren't drinking, it could be heavy metals. However, with iron and zinc and copper, they were well below the maximum livestock concentration limits. And in fact, even the copper was well below what sheep limits are because they're more sensitive to copper. Again, with nitrate and nitrite, we were again really low on getting it. Yes, there was some there. These are heavy metals can naturally be occurring in the environment as well, but our study did not have any significant concerns that came out of it. And so these water samples were processed at the CAFS lab that was mentioned earlier, looking at livestock drinking water. And so just to take home from that research is to think about, maybe if you are having livestock concerns and you have the resources, is maybe getting a before water sample just to know what your livestock are drinking. And then you would have that. Thinking about labs, there's some local labs that you could use. There's also the CAFS lab that was mentioned earlier. And one of the key things, we mentioned earlier about how to ship chickens. This is the same thing of making sure you have the right protocol, the right water bottle, the right storage, the right temperature, because not following those protocols can change the outcome. And then the last thing just to think about your take home from that study is look at your livestock. Are they drinking? Are they gant? Do they look like they're gaining weight? Do they look alert? Or their eyes droopy and their ears droopy? So, think about those types of things as well post-fire. A second project that mirrored where we went with looking at forage quality. This study was actually from ground that was not burned. And so again, looking at that ash content and what might be coming from the sky. And so a project with cooperative extension advisors across the North State, working with on-campus specialists, looked at hay, corn, hay stacks, pastures, and some corn silage. And again, good news, in the heavy metals, we did not detect any there. So that lead, mercury, arsenic, those big topics that we've heard a lot about, we did not have any detections from those samples. And we had low levels of those metals. So again, manganese came up again, iron, zinc, and copper. But again, below what the livestock concentration limits were. Another interesting one that we looked at was a little bit deeper dive into a more expensive test to look at a look further deeper into the toxicology analysis. And so looking at pesticides and other positive and negative ones. And so we did get 2 hits from a sample in Shasta County. One of them was from a pesticide insecticide, and then the other one was caffeine. So I'm not sure what happened with that sample. Someone might have collected it near their coffee cup or where someone had spilled it before, but we had 11 negative samples in that as well. And so again, the take home thinking about forage quality is think about getting forage samples. If it's something that concerns you, your local cooperative extension advisor can help you with resources and what that lab protocol is. CAFS lab does some. A lot of us will use, there's labs in New York and other parts of the state that can do those testing for you as well. And so if it's something that concerns you, think about it. Also monitoring closely your livestock body condition score, thinking about what that is, how much feed do they have, especially if it's land that's burned, and what that rejuvenation is, and where you're going to supplemental feed, and making sure that you are providing enough nutrients for those cattle or sheep or goats to maintain body condition score, and especially if they're in a reproductive phase, to be able to have adequate nutrients. So, and digging in a little bit deeper on that post-fire grazing side, again, there's not a one size fits all on here. I have 2 different papers. One of them, the top one that Katie's going to share out, and the bottom one, Katie will share. The top one is from colleagues looking at annual grasslands and that response, and what are some things to think about, as well as in the Intermountain region. And so Cooperative Extension has different resources based on where you are, and so we can make sure to get those to you through Katie, or if you have questions, we can follow up on them. But some things to think about post-fire in relation to your grazing program is, first of all, monitoring. What is that coming back? When is the rainfall? What was your severity? And if you have an interest in seeding, so thinking about if you want to seed, right? Like, do you have the tools to seed to be able to put it in the ground to make sure that you don't broadcast seed that then could be eaten by a lot of birds that happen to be looking for food and foraging as well, the financial resources, and what are your goals, or what are your desired species? So if you have a bunch of avena or wild oats coming in and it's a monoculture, you might want to think about how can we change that monoculture to have more diversity and forage quality as going forward. The other part of thinking about when you're looking at a grazing strategy for that is thinking about when that fire happens and the rainfall pattern. And so, what is the rainfall? What is the temperature? What is solar radiation? Like this year would have been really hard if you're in Northern California and it was really foggy. We got rain early in the year, but not a lot of rain and sunlight during the wintertime, that it took a long time for even grasses that weren't burned to take off. And so thinking about where your strategy is on grazing, and do you want to rest it maybe for 6 months? Do you have a reduced stocking rate? Are you able to feed somewhere else? Do you have invasives that are starting to come in? And we saw that post campfire in March. We saw a lot of yellow star thistle and medusa heads started coming in. And so we actually started grazing just a few months after the campfire with reducing stocking rates on ranches because we saw undesirable species coming in. And I think a good takeaway is some work that Josh Davey did a few years ago, and it was a controlled burn, and it showed that it took 3 years, granted that was during a drought season, but to get back to post-fire forage quality and quantity from before the fire. And so just something to think about what happens during fire. Like, you might look out there and you see a lot of green grass, but it's not the quantity and quality that was there pre-fire. And so adjusting your grazing program to meet that, and providing supplemental feed or finding additional land, or reducing your stocking rates. Another topic that has really come up that's important to think about is invasive species post-fire. And so maybe if you guys add in the chat, if you have a second, if you're near a keyboard, is what invasive weeds have you seen post-fire? And so Thinking about weed prevention, the prevention is the first step and the most cost-effective measure in invasive weed management. And so we want to limit ground disturbance, lip infectors, and know what those known invasive weeds are. And what happens during a fire, it's completely thrown out, right? So some key tips is after a fire, if you've been in a fire zone, is to do some surveys. And so think about what are those known vectors. So the access roads, some trails that might be there from livestock or hand crews that were going in, thinking about the right-of-ways, like alongside your roads, where equipment may have been parked, or staging areas, and other vulnerable areas, because you want to stop those invasive weeds before they have a chance to take over your pasture. And so that's a good tip, is to think about that. And just some case studies, which I think are very interesting and put it really into relation of how can these fires really influence invasive weeds on your private land. It was a project that we did after and during the campfire. And so that paper, Katie will share with all of you, talks about, there's 4 sites in it, but I'm just going to mention 2 of them really quickly. This one right here on the left-hand side, you can see a picture of a manzanita bush. It had been treated on the roadside edge with milestone earlier in the year and was controlling that invasive weed of yellow star thistle. And then oops, sorry, skip too quickly. And then in that second picture is where the fire came and it burned that brush. And if you look at the third picture on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see the star thistle starting to pop up. And so that bush, what was left of it, was cut by the crews. And so you saw that the site burned with moderate to high severity. And what we have now, based on that area had been treated, but the manzanita brush had suppressed any star thistle that was coming in, and that was a refuge for a new seed bank to come out and sprout. And so just something to think about, if you had a brush landscape, that could be changing based on post-fire and what will come in the next season. This is another example right here. These rocks were moved for to fix some stabilize a hillside, and you can see all the star thistle coming in. And so again, it was a case of disturbance, move the rocks. There was no yellow star thistle there prior to the fire, but because the fire crews had come in, they had moved those, and it created a new refugee for the yellow star thistle. And so what are these concerns, right? So you didn't have pre-fire, maybe invasive weeds on your property, maybe you had some, but that fire and that disturbance, whether it be by people or the fire itself, can change what is on your land. And so some things to think about is, especially if you have horses, yellow star thistle. Another one would be with milkweed. So milkweed, there's been some cases where it will rejuvenate after fire. It also has reduced competition. And so it can come in there and come up. And so milkweed, most of the time, cattle and sheep and goats will avoid it. But if there's not a lot for them to eat post-fire and you reintroduce them, it could become a toxic concern. So just something to think about. It is a native plant and an important pollinator species, but I think it's a part of your overall management, is something to consider. The same thing with lupin. Most species of lupin aren't a concern, but it can be toxic to sheep, goats, and cattle. Another one to think about for cattle owners and sheep and goats, but cattle particularly, where the CAFS lab has seen this, is with pine needle toxicity. So your land burns, you are going to go feed some supplemental feed. You might think, oh, we're going to go put it up on the hillside, right? Like we've replanted the lowlands, perhaps, or we're going to rest that area from grazing. But the concern comes in is if you feed supplemental feed on the pine needles, it can cause abortion of cattle from pine needles. And so it's just something to think about as you are planning and adjusting how you do things. What could be those unintended consequences? And the Livestock Poisoning Plant Guide is a phenomenal book put together by some colleagues at UC Davis, including some at the CAFS lab, that go through a number of poisonous plants. I just highlighted a few of them there for you to keep into consideration. Another area to think about is under infrastructure. And so during a fire, you're going to lose, right? You could lose fencing, drinking water. And so to think about where your cattle are going to get that, what is the reliability, the legal aspects, right? And your safety and your neighbor's safety on making sure that those fences are secure. And it's not just the fences themselves, right? But if the trees have burned and then you have a windstorm and they fall over. So it's all things to think about. And it might not be that first year, but it could be in year 2, 3, and 4. These are sometimes the challenges post fire go on beyond the first year. And so thinking about your infrastructure and making sure your cattle or sheep and goats have clean drinking water, what their supplemental feeding needs are, and how you're going to feed them, and where. And then thinking about if you have small ruminants, especially and you're in a high predator area, is to think about what is that shelter need, perhaps, and keeping them safe, and what are those deterrents that you can have to prevent it. And then for facilities, right? If something gets sick, do you have a place and a way to doctor it? Do you have a way to ship your cattle? Can you work with your neighbor to do that? And so, again, that's all dependent on the fire impacts and the livestock species. But it's a lot of challenges, and it's a lot for a livestock producer, no matter whether you're small or large, to take on. And so, on that, there is some recovery assistance that may be available to livestock producers. We found from the survey that I shared in the beginning that less than half of the people are accessing this or know that it's available. And so wanting to put this out there that there is some recovery options available for commercial livestock producers. And so if you have acres that are burned, there's resources to cover supplemental feed. If you have hay that was in a barn that was stored, movement of livestock to alternative locations. Also, if you happen to have direct losses and mortality from the fire that are above normal, then you can also be compensated for those. A key part to that is to make sure you get those verified, whether it be by a veterinarian or by a cooperative extension agent, or even a firefighter has done it, or your ag department. There's a lot of resources out there that will help verify those to make sure that you have that documentation. And then the other part under ECP, the USDA Farm Service Agency will not only replace your interior fences, but your exterior fences. So if you had cross fencing, they'll repair water infrastructure and troughs, and they'll also remove those burned barns and fencing. And so they will not cover your personal side. And so I think that's something that would be under your house insurance. They are looking at what would be farm related specifically. And it's not only post-fire where USDA can come in, but if you're interested, Natural Resources Conservation Service also has the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which can help you with fuel load reduction, developing a managed grazing program, and cross fencing. They will not help you with exterior fencing. That's considered a capital improvement at this time. And so they will only do interior fencing to help improve grazing management. So that's another resource that folks might be interested in as livestock producers. And then also UC Cooperative Extension. You've heard from us today here. We're here to support landowners' recovery from future wildfires. So we're looking at policy reforms, conducting targeted outreach, and integrated coordination. So in conclusion, to think about, making sure you prepare, you plan, you practice, and you discuss what your fire plan is. During a wildfire, don't wait and execute that plan. And then during recovery, ask for help. There's UC Cooperative Extension. There's folks at UC Davis that will help. There's the Farm Service Agency. There's also our fire safe councils and resource conservation districts and others in your community that might be a resource. So I will turn it back over to Katie.
Thank you, Tracy. That awesome presentation. Now it's just going to be an open Q&A session with both of our speakers. So if any of you have questions for either of them, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can type it in the chat. And maybe while folks are coming up with questions, we do have a couple. One is from Deb for Richard, I believe, and it says, how much testing is done in industrial settings, and then how often and for what?
That is a great question, but it is very much outside my area of expertise. I work with live chickens for the most part. So I would, if this question, which I think is probably about soil testing, I would refer you to Katie for a partner set of information on soil and fire.
Yeah, Deb, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, I was specifically concerned about the egg testing for lead levels and those kinds of things, not necessarily the soil, but how is there a limit for industrial egg production as far as what's an acceptable level of lead? Do they even test for that? What's I
Yeah,
don't know.
thanks for clarifying that. That I can answer. Um, so most large scale egg production would probably not be testing for lead just because they have very strict environmental control over the environment that the birds are in. So they're in a particular location for pretty much their entire life.
Right.
And they would not have they shouldn't have any sort of heavy metal contaminant. So they wouldn't have lead paint within a poultry barn or something like that.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you, Richard. We have another question for Tracy. Do you know how pine needles can cause abortions for cattle?
So one of them is an acid, and I think there's also a belief that the poking of the needles might also have something in some of the small ruminants. But there is a paper done a while ago, and I can add that into the chat here in a second if I can find it really quick. I saw the question pop up, and I think it was Dr. Moss, one of our cooperative extension specialists, wrote it a number of years ago, but it's still good information. So I'll add that here in just a second.
Thank you. Christy asked in the Q&A session, noting that they have a particular interest on pollinators and floral resources after fire. So they were wondering if there are any studies on how post-fire might affect honeybees and also native bees. I don't know if Tracy or Richard, you have any information on how fire affects bees, but I can speak maybe to more the native bee side. So there have been several studies done by colleagues, UC colleagues from UC Riverside on the impacts of wildfires on native bee populations, particularly in the Sierra Nevada. And they have found that wildfires can benefit native bee populations because they're creating more habitat and more abundant food sources post-fire with the resprouting of native wildflowers. In some cases, native honeybees actually increased in size, and that might be due to increase in food availability. But just a quick search, wildfire smoke in terms of honeybee populations, too much smoke can negatively impact the health of native honeybees. So yeah, there are many UC ANR, UC Cooperative Extension advisors and specialists that do work on honeybees, Christy. So I can definitely reach out to them and connect you if you're
If I could
interested.
just add, because I know
Yeah.
the Sierras and like the wild space, even a little higher up in the mountain
Mhm.
than where the Eaton fire is,
Yes.
were affected here. But in this urban area that had so many contaminants that are showing up in the soil, I was kind of more concerned about what the floral resources might be
Mm,
uptaking. And then the honeybees and native bees and pollinators in general that, are providing more pollination, I will say, for edible gardens and
yeah.
even the wild flowers, and how that might be affecting them if they're
Thanks.
taking any contaminants in. Because if you're talking about the cattle, that's like a large animal, and these are tiny little insects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And thank you for clarifying. I'm seeing in the chat right now our last after the fire webinar on soil remediation and contamination. And part of that webinar does cover plant nutrient uptake post-fire. Sorry, I cannot type and talk at the same time. But they did not specifically address uh, the pipeline of plant uptaking potential contaminants to then impacting pollinators. So I can definitely ask someone about that. I don't know enough information to speak of that right now.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else have any specific questions for Richard or Tracy? Well, if not, I think we can end a couple minutes early tonight. Thank you so much to Richard and Tracy for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us this evening. Yeah, thank you so much and have a great evening.